Good afternoon, professor and classmates. We're group number 5. We're composed by Maria Isabel Montero, Viviana Jimenez, Ariana Fernandez, Nicole Rodriguez, and Sara Melendez. And today we're going to talk about our comparative analysis, Costa Rica versus Malta. Historical evolution of Costa Rica.
Costa Rica is a country in Central America that stands out among many others for its democratic system, but it hasn't always been like this. Between the 16th and the 19th century, Costa Rica was a province of the Captaincy General of Guatemala, like the rest of Central American countries. Costa Rica at that time was a country with scarce resources since its small population consisted mostly of farmers. In Costa Rica, it was decided to proclaim independence from Spain. In 1812, the Constitution of Cádiz came into force, granting Costa Ricans the freedom to elect deputies and municipalities. On October 11, total independence from Spain was proclaimed in Costa Rica. The news came that day from Guatemala to Cartago, which was the capital at the time. With the independence of Costa Rica from Spain, two groups emerged in Costa Rica called the monarchies, that had ideas of rejoining the crown, and the group of republicans, who had ideas of maintaining independence and forming a republic in Costa Rica. Between these two groups, a battle was formed called the Battle of Chomoco. After the battle and the victory of the Republicans, the capital moved to San Jose. In Costa Rica, the first head of state was Mr. Juan Mora Fernandez. Mr. José María Castro Madriz became the first president of Costa Rica. In 1856, Costa Rica faced another threat against its sovereignty. A group of Americans who were in Nicaragua wanted to submit Costa Rica to their power. The president at the time, Juan Rafael Mora Porras, prepared Costa Rica to fight for the country and independence. In 1870, the Coffee families overthrew Don Jesus Jimenez by a military coup led by Mr. Tomás Guardia, who later took over against the families and became the governor of Costa Rica. In 1899, two political parties appeared in Costa Rica, the Liberal Progressive Party and the Constitutional Democratic Party. The elections were won by Ascencio Esquivel by the Liberal Progressive Party. But the people feared that the government of Don Bernardo Soto would not respect the elections, which led more than 7,000 Costa Ricans to march with machetes and sticks to assert their vote. On November 7, 1942, the Costa Rica Democracy Day was decreed. Since then, Costa Rica continued to be a democratic republic and even abolished the army in 1948. When Figueres was elected to power, he made many changes, including the abolition of the army and many social guarantees. He came to power thanks to the Olate Figueres Treaty, which gave the army a time of 18 months to change the constitution of the country and came under the new national constitution. Nowadays, Costa Rica has been mostly dominated by two parties, the PLN, Partido Liberación Nacional, and the PUSC, Partido Unidad Social Cristiana. These parties have been the dominant party for most of the political history of Costa Rica.
Historical evolution of Malta. A southern European island country that is known for having one of the most interesting histories in evolution. The country was inhabited for millennia, but the start of the population arriving to the island was shaped by the geography of it. Back in the year 1479, the marriage of Catholic monarchs Fernando II of Aragon and Isabella of Castile led to the unification of Spain. Malta, for that reason, became part of the vast Spanish Empire. Consequently found itself on a major struggle between two religions, Islam and Christianity. That led them to become into the most powerful clashes between East and West, and that was the start of Malta as we know it today. Malta was shown incredible bravery during the World War II, but the island ended up completely devastated. With nationalist Prime Minister Dr. George Borg Oliver commanding Malta, was finally able to gain its independence, with the Queen Elizabeth II as the head of the state in that time. Malta remained within the British Commonwealth, represented by the Governor-General. And in 1973, all the employment laws were updated, taking care of gender equality being introduced, in rights like salary pay, civil marriage was introduced, and homosexuality and adultery were discriminalized. Heading to 1974, Malta became a republic. Following to 1979, the links with Britain, signed agreements with Libya, USSR, and North Korea were declaring neutrality. Malta was the scene for the historical meetings between USSR and US leaders that signed the end of the Cold War. In 2004, Malta joined the European Economic Community, and in 2008 became part of the Eurozone, which helped for the economic growth and diversify the local economy. On the year 2013, the government was still producing the economic development since the Maltese economy did not perform well in the interwar period. and was severely affected during the World War II. And they continue to build that economy and society until nowadays.
Central characteristics of the presidential political system, institutional design, Costa Rica. The structure of political institutions in democracies remains in the division of powers established in the political constitution. There is a relatively strong separation between parliament and executive. A third branch, judiciary, is also part of this system. The executive branch is represented in a president elected by the people, who is both the head of state and head of government, with the power to appoint and remove cabinet members, and who is exempt from responding politically to the legislative, being the president the most important figure, and a separate legislative branch, also elected by popular vote. Both are forced to cooperate in their relationship, and both have fixed terms. This direct election is by which the government receives its legitimacy. The existence of a balance of power between both branches must be assumed for the sake of democracy, with effective governance and control. The president cannot belong to parliament. He can only lose his position through a successful impeachment process. There's also the impossibility of dissolution of parliament by the president. When there's a divided government, there may be a political gridlock. To obtain the approval of a certain law, the president can form a coalition with the opposition, and his appointment in office doesn't depend on the confidence of his party. The greater concentration of power in the president is counterbalanced by limits in the exercise of the mandate, that is, by the constitutional prohibition of continuous re-election. This separation of powers works as a system of checks and balances, and allows the executive and the legislature to carry out their work without the approval of the other branches, and controlling the executive in abuses of power. Costa Rica is a republic that is democratic, independent, and free. Its government is popular, representative, alternative, and responsible, exercised by three supreme powers that are different and independent from each other: executive, legislative, and judicial power.
Central characteristics of the parliamentary political system institutional design of Malta. In the case of Malta, it's important to mention that it's an independent monarchy, a parliamentary state, a unitary multi-party republic, and that is part of the Commonwealth. Also, power is divided between three branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial one. In the case of the executive, power is in the hands of the Prime Minister, who is the head of government, and that is responsible for coordinating the work of ministers. The Prime Minister is chosen from the political party that commands the majority of seats in the House of Representatives, and he can advise the President to dissolve the House of Representatives. In the case of the judicial branch, it's important to mention that it's composed of courts such as the lower courts, the courts of appeal, the Constitutional Court, and other institutions. In the case of the legislative branch, power is in the hands of the House of Representatives, which is formed by 65 representatives elected for a period of 5 years. And the role of the House of Representatives is key because they are in charge of approving and denying laws, amendment matters, controlling the government, and electing the Prime Minister of Malta. Also, the House of Representatives elects a president called a Speaker, who is in charge of directing the administration of the Parliament, as well as exercising the institutional representation of the House, being this the second authority of the state.
Influences that determine the presidential political system in Costa Rica. In the case of France, the influence from France were passed by the philosophers Rousseau and Montesquieu. Rousseau democracy designate the form of government in which the population guided the laws and the government implement them, always protecting the sovereignty of the people. In the case of Montesquieu, he explained in his theory that the separation of powers limited the use of it and secured the freedom and the rights of the people. Notably, there are some of the bases that create the political systems known today in Costa Rica. France's influence may be seen in different forms, like the public institutions work, the implementation of a national civil code, and the population influence in lawmaking. In the case of USA first of all started giving political advice to Costa Rica, then helped economically, and today the United States influence is implemented and secured in the support they gave to the national territory in the military support, scientific and economic and cultural support. Indeed, both countries have been fundamental for the political system of Costa Rica. Influence that determined the parliamentary political system of Malta. At first, it was occupied by French. When they left, it was occupied by the British. This caused that in 1814, by the Treaty of Paris, Malta became part of the United Kingdom. Then the National Assembly of Malta requested the British government to issue a new constitution with political and administrative autonomy. A crisis happened and a new constitution, who was elected by the Maltese people, and a new government were made. Malta became independent in 1963 and became a republic in 1974. The influence Britain has in this country is that at first sight we can look that it implemented a parliamentary as them. And second, the way the parliament works in Malta is under a set of rules which have been inspired on the British House of Commons, but modified to imply it in a smaller parliament. The Maltese parliament, for example, has been built in their own structure through the experiences they went through, mostly because of the political instability problem. So, Malta's influence is from the Britain and their own experiences.
Main conclusions. This comparative analysis allows us to understand more about the similarities and differences between both systems. Also, it helps us to extract advantages and disadvantages of both of them. It's important to mention that according to a sociologist Juan Lins, a disadvantage of the presidential system is the fact that the legislative and the executive branch are independent, and that creates an eternal dispute better called as executive-legislative deadlock, which is the state of inaction resulting from the opposition of equally powerful and intransigent factions. And if we take into account this, and if we analyze the current situation of countries as El Salvador, it's important to highlight that these disputes actually puts in danger democracy. That's why it's a disadvantage.
Another conclusion. Analyzing both political systems, presidential and parliamentary, the comparative method used was the most different systems design, MDSD, or method of similarity. The MDSD compares different systems that have in common the same dependent variable, so similarities are crucial in this comparison. And this method sees how strong the relationship among these variables are. We can conclude that some of the similarities found in these countries are aspects like the democratic voting system, the division of powers, that both systems have bodies that make law, that both systems require accountability of the government, thus effectiveness, the fact that each of the president and prime minister get weakened because of failure to control a legislative majority.
Another important thing to mention is the remarkable history both countries have. To analyze any type of government or political system, we consider that it was important to look back and see how those two territories achieved their positions, either on the economic side, the political one, or even as a society. In the case of Costa Rica, we can see a democracy being built in, and in the case of Malta, seeing how they started and tried turning into a republic, and then searching for their independence. That led to two different developments for each territory, and everything started because of the conquest from Spain. But it's interesting how that can happen when they were part of the same event on the world, and seeing the progress and evolution of each country in every aspect. They have similarities and differences, but the most important part of the research was learning about a different country like Malta. We grow learning about Costa Rica, its evolution on every single way, but the most enriching part of the investigation has been learning on how all around the globe we can find totally different histories, how they are managed on its government position, and a totally different path on how each country is as we know it today.
Recommendations. With this comparative analysis, we may see the power opposition that in the organs had been damaging the development of the government's agenda. This problem has been growing with the passing of times and after analyzing two different types of political systems under history. We can comprehend that there is a need to find solutions to avoid any internal conflict. That is why a first solution may be that the actors in charge of the different powers listen more to the needs of the population instead of seeking for projects that only benefit their parties. On the other hand, there could be an ideology change that at first they are competing as individual parties, but when they go to government, they are all in charge of developing the country in an efficient way. Lastly, there could be ways to improve the powers relationship just by looking at other countries that are working successfully and their techniques.
Costa Rica is a democratic republic in which there is a head of state, known as the president. In Malta, there is instead a monarchy, where the head of state is the prime minister. Both of them have the function to run the country the best way they can. Something that can be changed is the political system of Costa Rica, since for many years it has been questioned, and many believe that it can change to a parliamentary system. An example of how the system has been questioned is that the system prevents the government from advancing through the assembly seat system, since if the president of the party wins and the majority of the assembly is from another party, they will rarely support the president. Instead, when it comes to having a parliamentary system, government is presented on the basis of a system of assemblies, where attendance is determined depending on the parliamentary majority.
Thank you for your attention.